Stephen King, the Mandarin of Malady, the Viceroy of Vicious, the Captain of Catastrophe, the Presidente of Peril, Deacon of the Dreadful. He has money, he has sales, he has his publisher's testicles in a vice grip. He has everything, it seems, but respect. Which sort of begs the question, what is respect when it comes to literature? What does respect mean in the world of words? One of the easiest ways to ascertain just what it might mean is what it means, how it sounds, when someone does put respect on a writer's name. You've heard the reverie when someone talks about Ernest Hemingway, the alliterated admiration around praise for William Shakespeare. Perhaps we could channel just a little bit of Machiavelli and ask, have you ever heard someone say the name of William Faulkner without respect's near cousin, fear? Surely we can agree that these writers have what is known as respect from readers and critics alike. So, respect, it seems to me, in the world of words, means that your work is considered classic. And if there has ever been anyone who perfectly entails the respectful critic, perhaps it is Harold Bloom. And I have here a book called Modern Critical Views, Stephen King, edited and with an introduction by Harold Bloom. And I would like to read an extended quote from that introduction. It says, quote, "I will confine this brief introduction to just two of King's works, Carrie and The Shining, equally famous and clearly representative of his achievement, whatever that is. With great effort, I have just reread both after an interval of some years. The narrative line of each book has a certain coherence and drive. The prose is undistinguished, and there is nothing much that could be termed characterization or inwardness, or even vivid caricature. And yet there is an imagistic strength in both tales, by which I do not mean individual images, but rather the heaping up of events to constitute giant or central images. King's most authentic continuity with Gothic masters like Mary Shelley in Frankenstein and Poe in his stories is his ability to concentrate upon the reader what the reader is compelled to see. Carrie and The Shining have self-immolation as an Arctic funeral pyre, or Poe's nightmare evocations of the shades of deceased beauties. And yet Carrie, at the prom, first humiliated as a scapegoat and then horribly triumphant as a fiery avenger, is a figure of American literature, but she seems to have entered our folklore as the apotheosis of the wallflower, and a caution to many. Similarly, the image of a mother and her boy pursued by a crazed husband-father, himself victimized by demons, outlasts the tired tracts of The Shining's prose. A prolix storyteller, generally trapped by his own facility, King nevertheless has a kind of archetypal power of the image. As I understand what I have learned to call the American religion, no American truly feels free unless she is alone, and no intensely spiritual American believes that she is part of the creation. Though he has a secular sensibility, King implicitly endowed the boys of his earlier novels with the conviction that the best part of their selves was older and wiser than the corrupt adult world. whether manifested by individuals or institutions. A perpetual contrast between youthful value and mature depravity enabled King to fashion a sequence of pervasive images of sympathetic horror. In his recent work, the most popular of writers has retreated from boyish protagonists, perhaps out of an uneasiness at repeating himself. Yet the later books rarely sustained the enormous images summoned up by Carrie and The Shining. I cannot locate any aesthetic dignity in King's writing. His public could not sustain it, nor could he. There is a palpable sincerity to everything that he has done that testifies to his decency and to his social benignity. Art, unfortunately, is rarely the fruit of earnestness, and King will be remembered as a sociological phenomenon, an image of the death of the literate reader. End quote. Harold Bloom, then, I think it is safe to say, is on the side of things that says no. Stephen King does not write classic. Stephen King does not deserve respect. But Harold Bloom does not get to make these decisions. Perhaps Harold Bloom would do well to remember the fact that in his time, William Shakespeare was seen as entertainment, not as literature, or that in his time, Walt Whitman was seen as something of an oddity. Ernest Hemingway, for his part, was published in all of the popular magazines. There is an element to the classic, which means that it has to have been read. I'd like to read to you now a definition from Wikipedia, the definition of classic car. Quote, there is no fixed definition of a classic car. They are usually older cars, typically 25 years or older, though definitions vary. A common theme is of an older car of historical interest to be collectible and tend to be restored rather than scrapped, though sometimes age is not a factor. End quote. Of historical interest to be collected. As we sit here right now, perhaps you are not a Stephen King fan. I would not consider myself to be a Stephen King fan. All of us, however, know someone who is. All of us, however, know someone, I guarantee, that has one or two Stephen King books which they will never throw away, even if that individual is less than likely to reindulge in the book. The same way that one who collects classic cars is probably less than likely to drive them all the time. There is something sentimental that saturates the physical object itself. For Stephen King, it seems to be the horror which had been invoked. On Wikipedia now, we're going to jump to the question of classical rock, all the way down to the programming section of the article, where it says, quote, typically classic rock stations play rock songs from the mid-60s through the 80s and began adding 1990s music in the early 2010s. Most recently, there has been a, quote, newer classic rock, end quote, under the slogan of the next generation of classic rock stations such as WLLZ in Detroit, WBOS in Boston, WKQQ in Lexington, play music focusing more on harder-edge classic rock from the 1980s to the 2000s. And I have to offer a little bit of conjecture here. Probably this article was written or updated or edited or whatever it is that Wikipedia articles go through by someone who was born in the 90s, because as someone who was born in the 80s, I remember when the revelation stated here about classic rock stations playing music from the 90s was classic rock stations playing music from the 80s. I remember driving around in my automobile and finding myself haplessly, absent-mindedly singing along to I Go to Extremes by Billy Joel. Bum 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 bum. You know the song, probably. I certainly did. During the song, I was too high singing the lyrics and was immediately brought too low in the aftermath of that song. Why? Because when the DJ came back on, I realized that I had been listening to the classic rock station, and Stormfront by Billy Joel was the very first album I ever remember coming out. Suddenly, I had been transformed into a classic rock connoisseur, a man nostalgic for the new and happening notes of his youth. But how could that be? I wasn't old. There was not yet all of this hair in my ears. I didn't even have a lawn to yell at children to get away from. But like the Roman centurion guard, time marches only forward. Yes, I was getting old. Immediately I changed the station to the pop songs, and I couldn't even understand the words they were using. But enough about me being old and still devastatingly handsome. We're here to talk about Stephen King. We've already established that the idea of the classic has something to do with sentimentality, and probably nothing to do with age. Oftentimes with music, the idea of a classic rock song means a song that is 25 to 30-ish years old. With the aforementioned idea of classic cars are 25 years or older more often than not, and if you're talking about antique, you're talking about something that is 45 years old. Well, the novel Carrie, that Harold Bloom was so sure to mention, and which I guarantee you, if you ask all of your reader friends, if you have 10 reader friends, 5 of them own a copy of Carrie. Carrie was published April 5th, 1974. We are therefore inching closer and closer to Carrie being 50 years old, which, funnily enough, Carrie was published in 1974. Carrietta in White in the novel was 16 years old, which means we would be celebrating Carrie's retirement. Neither here nor there, just something funny to think about. So, Carrie, for example, from the canon of Stephen King, is both old enough and carries the sentimentality to the thing, meaning that the books themselves are imbued with the type of psychic subjoiner that does not let the owner of the physical thing throw it away. And here's another part perhaps to this argument. When asking whether or not Stephen King wrote or possibly is writing classics, we have to consider the fact that even Hemingway didn't write only classics. Even Shakespeare wrote Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Though it was a collaboration, still, he wrote The Two Gentlemen of Verona on his own. So I'm not making the argument for From a Buick 8 by Stephen King itself, 21 years old now, to be a classic. But Salem's Lot is 48 years old. The Shining, 47. The Stand, 46 years old. The Stand, to my experience, is the book that, look, sometimes you hear people say, for example, Ernest Hemingway is a writer's writer. Nate Diaz is a fighter's fighter. Patrice O'Neal was a comedian's comedian. These people may not be the most widely known or appreciated or respected, but the people who are in the cloth of the thing respect these people. For people folded in the cloth of Stephen King, The Stand is oftentimes the novel they hold up, they hail to be the best of Stephen King's works. Published all the way back in 1978. And for a second, can we just appreciate that run of novels for Stephen King? 1974, Carrie. 1975, Salem's Lot. 1977, The Shining. 1978, The Stand. It seems to be amazing what the booger sugar will do for you. That is not an endorsement or financial advice. But if we're talking about the classic definition of classic, the 25-year cutoff, Stephen King has 34 novels that could be up for consideration for what it means to be a classic. The last, published in 1998, being Bag of Bones. You might remember this as the book which came out right before 1999's The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. In that list, obviously, starting with 34, 1998's Bag of Bones certainly has its group of fans. There is 1996's Desperation, 1996's The Green Mile, 1994's Insomnia. There is, of course, 1987's Tommyknockers, 1987's Misery, 1986's It, 1984's Thinner, 1983's Pet Sematary, as well as 1983's Christine, and 1981's Cujo, which Stephen King admits in, I believe, On Writing, the book On Writing, he doesn't even remember writing. So, will Stephen King be remembered for penning classics, or will future generations look back on Stephen King the way they may be destined to look back on Debbie Macomber? I'm going to make one more argument here for Stephen King being the author of classics. Now, Stephen King, as of the latest estimates that I could find, July 4th, 2023, has sold 350 million books. Now, I know this might seem like an argument that I'm making that, hey, he's made a lot of money doing this. Surely he's writing classics. If that were the case, then I would have to make the same type of argument for Debbie Macomber, right? Surely she has made untold amounts of money from the books that you can find in the corner of the local grocery store. Surely that is the case. But, and much like Debbie Macomber, who I know it sounds like I am trying to tear down, but I promise that is not the case. I think there is absolutely a place for anything that Debbie Macomber is writing. And I would even make the argument that there is probably a higher percentage of these Debbie Macomber books that get sold which end up being read. Which is to say, in short, that I don't think anyone is buying Debbie Macomber books for the sort of collector value or the sentimentality behind them, though I'm sure those things happen. I would venture to guess, and it's only a guess, that for every Stephen King book which is sold that does not end up being read, it is instead collected, there is somewhere some tattered, bent, and broken copy of The Shining which gets read every winter. The argument I'm making here is something like a Lifetime Achievement Award, but not quite. I have on this channel a read-along series for The Shining, It's 16 videos, 18 videos, 20 videos, something like that. I can't remember exactly. But that series continues to get views. I think I dropped it 3 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that. It just continues to get views and views and views. And unlike many of the residual views that I have on this channel for literature that I have done in the past, made videos for in the past, I know 100% those views are not, well, I know 95%. Those views are not coming from people who are trying to cram content so that they can write a paper for their English 304 class. People read and reread their Stephen King novels. So this, I think, in my opinion, has to be something to do with Stephen King penning novels that continue to garner that interest from their readers, that in the truest measure of literature that I can come up with, every time people read these Stephen King novels, they must be a different novel than the last time these people read that Stephen King novel, meaning that there are things in the novel that change and age with you, that you are reading into the novel instead of extracting out of the novel. Just like in last week's episode, I talked about the true measure of literature not being the literature itself, but what people can make from that literature. And if people are seeking out some yahoo like myself on YouTube talking about The Shining years after that series was made, there must be something to it. Even if the love for Stephen King is not endorsed by Harold Bloom, even if that love of Stephen King escapes the wherewithal of our most prominent literary critic to explain. Yes, I believe Stephen King probably does write classics. Not all the time. Probably not since 1990 something, but yeah, those still count. Most notably, in my estimation, The Shining and It probably count as American classics, will probably be read 100 years from now. As we already talked about, Carrie is approaching 50 years old. And just as sort of an interesting practice, I'm going to go back to the week ending in the 6th of April, 1974 on top40weekly.com and look at the top songs from that week. The week that Carrie was published. Number 1, Too Hooked on a Feeling by Blue Suede. Number 2, Benny and the Jets by Elton John. Number 3, Hooked on a Feeling by Blue Suede, not Too Hooked on a Feeling. Number 3, Sunshine on My Shoulders by John Denver. Number 4, Seasons in the Sun, I did it again, by Terry Jacks. Number 5, The Lord's Prayer by Sister Janet Mead. Number 6, Come and Get Your Love from Redbone. Number 7, Dark Lady from Cher. Number 8, TSOP from MFSB. Number 9, Mockingbird by Carly Simon and James Taylor. Number 10, The Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me by Gladys Knight and the Pips. Oddly enough, number 11 was Jet by Paul McCartney and the Wings, and number 12 was Oh My My by Ringo Starr. Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein were both in the theaters in 1974, as was The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Longest Yard, starring Burt Reynolds, Foxy Brown, starring the incomparable Pam Grier. Surely, in that spiel of media from other mediums, there are some things you would consider a classic. Do any of them have a higher current cultural appeal and or impact than Carrie, as written by Stephen King. Maybe. You still hear those songs from time to time. There are still people who can quote Young Frankenstein and Blazing Saddles. Benny and the Jets is certainly in constant Muzak rotation somewhere. But I dare contend that Carrie is as classic Americana as any of those other pieces of media. And if you don't agree, that's fine, but, well, they're all going to laugh at you. And now we will have a literary excerpt of the week, we will have a poem of the week, and we will spend some time addressing comments from last week's episode. And as we have spent nearly 30 minutes now speaking about Stephen King, it is only fitting if we round this out with an excerpt from a Stephen King novel, this being It by Stephen King, obviously. Chapter 1, After the Flood, 1957. The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. The boat bobbed, listed, righted itself again, dived bravely through treacherous whirlpools, and continued on its way down Witcham Street toward the traffic light which marked the intersection of Witcham and Jackson. The 3 vertical lenses on all sides of the traffic light were dark this afternoon in the fall of 1957, and the houses were all dark too. There had been steady rain for a week now, and 2 days ago the winds had come as well. Most sections of Derry had lost their power then, and it was not back on yet. A small boy in a yellow slicker and red galoshes ran cheerfully alongside the newspaper boat. The rain had not stopped, but it was finally slackening. It tapped on the yellow hood of the boy's slicker, sounding to his ears like rain on a shed roof. A comfortable, almost cozy sound. The boy in his yellow slicker was George Denborough. He was 6. His brother, William, known to most of the kids at Derry Elementary School, and even to the teachers who would never have used the nickname to his face, as Stuttering Bill, was at home, hacking out the last of a nasty case of influenza. In that autumn of 1957, 8 months before the real horrors began, and 28 years before the final showdown, Stuttering Bill was 10 years old. Bill had made the boat beside which George now ran. He had made it sitting up in bed, his back propped against a pile of pillows, while his mother played Für Elise on the piano in the parlor, and rain swept restlessly against his bedroom window. About 3/4 of the way down the block as one headed toward the intersection and the dead traffic light, Witcham Street was blocked to motor traffic by smudge pots and 4 orange saw horses. Stenciled across each of the horses was Derry Dept of Public Works. Beyond them, the rain had spilled out of gutters clogged with branches and rocks and big sticky piles of autumn leaves. The water had first pried fingerholds in the paving and then snatched whole, greedy handfuls. All of this by the 3rd day of the rains. By noon of the 4th day, big chunks of the street's surface were boating through the intersection of Jackson and Witcham like miniature whitewater rafts. By the time many people in Derry had begun to make nervous jokes about arcs. The Public Works Department had managed to keep Jackson Street open, but Witcham was impassable from the sawhorses all the way to the center of town. But everyone agreed the worst was over. The Kentucky stream had crested just below its banks in the barrens and bare inches below the concrete sides of the canal, which channeled it tightly as it passed through downtown. Right now, a gang of men, Zach Denbrough, George and Bill's father among them, were removing the sandbags they had thrown up the day before with such panicky haste. Yesterday, overflow and expensive flood damage had seemed almost inevitable. God knew it had happened before. The flooding in 1931 had been a disaster which had cost millions of dollars and almost 24 lives. That was a long time ago, but there were still enough people around who remembered it to scare the rest. One of the flood victims had been found 25 miles east of Bucksport. And to keep this family friendly, that's where that quote ends. Stephen King has done interviews ad nauseum, and sometimes those interviews bring up the idea of it. And one of the things that he has said he was trying to do in that novel was kind of to create the boogeyman. This sort of generic, all-purpose, perhaps sight unseen spooky guy. Perhaps a post-World War, post-nihilist idea of death. And for the poem we're going to read this week, we turn once again to Emily Dickinson, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised our horses' heads were towards eternity. Maybe, just maybe, one day one of these The Weekly Reader episodes that I do will be over how underappreciated Emily Dickinson really is. If I can ramble on for 30 minutes about Stephen King, by God, I can talk for 30 minutes about Emily Dickinson. Just don't hold me to only 30 minutes. Look, I have a nearly 100 video playlist already on Emily Dickinson on the channel, and I am not afraid to add to that. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to comments. And look, I don't spend a whole lot of time on mean comments here on the channel, and God knows I get plenty of them, having been on YouTube for almost 8 years now, I think, since December of 2015. There's been plenty of negative comments pile up, but I want to focus right here for a second. Jane says, I'd like to listen, but the stress in your voice stresses me out. What does that mean, Jane? The stress in my voice, Jane? There's no stress in my voice, Jane. What could I possibly have to be stressed out about, Jane? Stress? Who? Me? Jane? There's no stress here, Jane. No reason to be stressed out, Jane. Then Callum left this comment, wow, the thumbnail looks better than usual. This was about the Is Literature Dead episode of The Weekly Reader. And Callum, I just have to ask, normally here on the channel, the thumbnails include me. But that episode for this series does not include the me. Is that what you're getting at, Callum? Will chimes in, firstly, as requested, you're beautiful. Thanks, Will. Secondly, thank you for the quote. I think once I am back home, I shall make a companion-style video on the same topic. Please do, and I just subscribed to your channel as well. Will goes on to say, excellent video and discussions on the matter at hand, and Google Trends is something I've never seen or heard of before. So Google Trends is not an exact science, but it's definitely something that's interesting to sort of toggle around with. It's definitely something that can be eye-opening. I had no idea that the literary trends that I addressed in Is Literature Dead were as compelling as they were. I had no idea when I set out to make that video that I would find that type of evidence just sitting there on top of the cake that is Google. Will continues by saying, for my own 2 pence on truth and beauty, neatly in one quote apropos of 1984 and then of 1 + 1 = 2, he goes on to quote, in the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it, not merely in the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy, and heresy of heresies was common sense, end quote. 1984 is one that I have to get around to at some point in time. Thank you for giving me the quote, Will. There's just so much literature in so little time. And then Todd chimes in, as I see it, the decline in literature you cite has at least 3 parents, which is plenty for anyone. The decline of reviewing, especially in newspapers, themselves tail-spinning towards a splat, and with it the end of literary taste as a subject of public discourse, the decline of the literary celebrity, God, I miss the Charlie Rose Show, and the rise of streaming cable TV as a source of real excellence. Now, Todd, I'm gonna jump in here and piggybacking off of that comment, go ahead and guess that you disagree with the premise of this episode. But as someone who you mentioned standing up sort of for the literary taste aspect of things, I'm interested to see what it is that you think about this subject. Do you agree that someone like Stephen King can write classics, or do you agree with Harold Bloom? Todd goes on to say, literature is going to have to get out there and hustle. I submit myself as a voodoo shaman candidate. I do my hustling on YouTube. Hell, I'm hustling you right now. We'll see about that, Todd. We'll see about that. Todd finishes his comment, and I will not apologize for the whiskey I once poured on William Faulkner's grave. It was Lafroig, after all, which is better than what the Count used to drink. I have no idea how badly I butchered the name of that whiskey, but I'm sure that I did. I'm just a hapless Kansas City bumpkin after all. But now I turn it over to you. What do you think? Can Stephen King be credited with Catholics? Can Stephen King be credited with classics? Give Stephen King a Catholic or two and something else might happen. Who is the greatest poet of all time, and why is it Emily Dickinson? How many books would a book chuck if a book chuck could chuck books? Let me know in the comments section. Ask your own questions in the comments section. That is all I have time for with this episode. If you hit that like button, it really does help me out here on the channel, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing that I talk about on this channel. Talking poetry every Monday, but also short story read-alongs, novel read-alongs, novel reviews, short story reviews, etc., on the channel. And I hope to have you back for the next one.